July 13th, 1944, Normandy, 9:42 a.m. Sergeant Curtis Cullen stood in the French dirt, grease under his fingernails, sweat stinging his eyes, and watched as General Omar Bradley stepped down from a dusty jeep near the outskirts of St. Lo. Cullen had spent 2 weeks building a weapon no one had asked for, testing it without permission, and now the next 30 seconds would decide whether the entire First Army broke out of Normandy or kept bleeding to death in the hedgerows. He was 29 years old, a cavalry recon man, zero engineering background, just a tank mechanic with a blowtorch, some stolen steel, and a problem nobody in high command could solve. The American Army had lost over 400 Shermans in 6 weeks. Not to tigers, not to panthers, but to hedgerows. Because the hedgerows weren't hedges. They were walls, 12 feet high, 4 feet thick, centuries-old earthworks laced with stone and roots, hardened by generations of French farmers marking property lines. Tanks tried to climb them and exposed their soft underbellies, 1 inch of armor between the crew and a German Panzerfaust. Most didn't make it. Most burned before the crew could even get out. Command tried everything. Dozer tanks were too few, too slow, and died first. Engineers packed explosives into hedge bases, only to get shelled while watching their charges leave barely a dent. Some tank crews welded track links to the front for more armor. Others just rammed the walls head-on. They buried themselves like metal tombstones in 500-year-old dirt. Cullen had another idea. He scavenged 4 lengths of steel from a German beach obstacle, Czech hedgehogs, 3-pronged anti-landing barriers the Germans had planted like sea urchins across the Normandy coast. American engineers had been cutting them apart since D-Day. Cullen took 4 spikes, angled them 35 degrees forward, and welded them to the front plate of a light tank. When the tank hit the hedge, the steel tusks didn't climb, they dug. They pierced. They split the wall open from the base. The tank stayed level. No belly shot. No dead crew. He ran 7 tests. 7 perfect breaches. Then word reached Major Sidney Bingham in 2nd Armored. Bingham wanted it on a real Sherman, a 33-ton beast, not some 15-ton tin can. The force might shear the welds clean off, might flip the tank nose first into the hedge. Lieutenant Charles Green of the 747th Tank Battalion volunteered. On July 11th, Cullen and Green's crew welded the rig, 320 pounds of raw steel, onto the Sherman's front. They ran 5 test charges over 2 days. 5 clean breaches. The tusks held. On July 13th, General Omar Bradley ordered a personal demonstration. He pointed to a hedgerow 200 yards away, 12 feet high, 4 feet thick, the kind of green wall that had eaten Shermans for 42 days straight. Green climbed into the commander's hatch. His gunner, Sergeant Frank Weber, ducked into the turret. The driver started the engine. Cullen stood beside Bradley, heart pounding. The Sherman backed up 50 yards. Dust kicked up behind the treads. The modified steel fangs glinted in the morning light. Green's voice crackled over the radio. Ready to demonstrate hedge breach. Bradley raised his binoculars. Proceed. The Sherman roared forward, engine screaming in 3rd gear. 25 miles per hour across open French pasture, straight toward a wall of earth and root that had stopped the entire U.S. First Army cold. The steel prongs hit the hedgerow like a freight train. Dirt exploded. Roots snapped. The front of the Sherman dipped, its tracks clawing for traction, the engine growling under the strain. 3 seconds passed. Then the hedgerow gave way. 5 centuries of packed earth split like wet paper. The Sherman didn't climb it. It punched through. In 14 seconds, it burst out the far side, its steel tusks dripping mud and root like bloodied teeth. Bradley lowered his binoculars. He walked to the shattered wall, crouched, ran his hand along the torn roots and mangled dirt. No belly exposure. No dead crew. No burning wreck. He turned to Major General J. Lawton Collins and asked one question. How many can we produce? Collins glanced at Cullen. We've got enough steel for 500. Bradley didn't hesitate. I want 3,000. Back to Cullen. That night, Bradley issued an emergency directive to the 52nd Ordnance Group. Strip every German beach obstacle between the beachhead and Cherbourg. Cut them down. Melt them. Weld them. Bolt them to everything that rolls. Every Sherman. Every Stuart. Every M10 tank destroyer. No exceptions. Operation Cobra launched in 12 days. That meant 3,000 tanks had to be modified in under 2 weeks. Do the math, 250 tanks per day, 10 per hour, 1 every 6 minutes. Around the clock. No margin for error. If Cullen's field-built Tusks worked in real combat, the American army would finally break out of Normandy. If not, thousands more men would die in the hedgerows. July 14th, near Colombiers, Normandy. Captain James Doherty from the 52nd Ordnance arrived with 30 welders and 6 cutting torch rigs. They set up an open-air production line in a field near an abandoned barn. No roof, no shade, just dust, sweat, and torches. The process: cut hedgehog beams into 4-foot sections. Grind edges to armor-piercing points. Weld to prefabricated mounting plates. Bolt plates to Sherman bow armor. Each install, for hours if everything worked perfectly. Nothing did. The Czech steel was tougher than expected, twice as hard as standard U.S. construction steel. Torches overheated every 20 minutes. Tips cracked. Oxygen regulators blew. By nightfall, they had 8 modified tanks. 8 out of 3,000. At that rate, the job would finish in October. Cobra launched in 12 days. July 15th, Cullen began troubleshooting. The issue was heat transfer. German steel absorbed thermal energy slower, causing the torch heads to seize up. He requisitioned every cutting torch in Normandy, pulled equipment from the 1st Engineer Special Brigade, created rotating teams. While one team cut, another cooled their gear. The process was brutal, but it worked. Output climbed to 22 tanks per day. Still not enough. Doherty brought in 40 more welders from maintenance battalions across the beachhead. July 17th, 2 days later. They hit 38 tanks per day. Better. Still short. Then came the next crisis. The Rhino modification, Cullen's 4-prong steel rig, weighed 320 pounds. Mounted on a Sherman's nose, it shifted the tank's center of gravity forward by 6 inches. The result? Suspension failure. Test vehicles showed stress fractures on their front springs after repeated hits. One tank threw a bogey wheel entirely. If that happened in combat, the tank wouldn't be shot, it would collapse. Cullen rewrote the install procedure. Instead of bolting the rig directly to the bow plate, he added structural brackets that distributed the weight across the Sherman's internal frame. It took 30 extra minutes per install, but it worked. No more fractures. July 19th, 6 days before Cobra. They hit 64 tanks per day, 400 vehicles total. Still 2,600 to go. Bradley's staff sent a priority message. We need 2,000 Rhinos before July 25th. Failure meant delaying Operation Cobra. Delaying Cobra meant the Germans reinforced the bocage. Delaying Cobra meant more American graves. Doherty found more steel. Engineers had cached a reserve pile of Czech hedgehogs near Utah Beach. Transportation companies moved the obstacles inland nonstop for 48 hours. Now the welders had enough raw material for 5,000 Rhinos. The bottleneck wasn't steel. It was time. And time was running out. July 21st, 1944, Normandy, for days to Cobra. Cullen knew he was out of time, so he found more time. He contacted every maintenance section from units not slated for Cobra's first wave. Tank recovery teams, mobile welders, field repair depots, anyone with a cutting torch and steel-toed boots. By midnight, 15 more welding stations roared to life under the Norman sky. Floodlights lit the fields like a nighttime factory floor. Sparks danced in the air. The smell of scorched flux and burning steel drifted across the hedgerows. Engines idled beside long lines of Shermans, waiting like warhorses for their final armor. No one slept more than 4 hours. July 22nd. Cobra was 72 hours away. Cullen hadn't blinked in 36. The total hit 1,200 Rhino tanks. Captain Doherty ran the math. If nothing breaks, we can hit 2,050 before go time. It would be just enough to meet Bradley's minimum. Then the steel ran out. Every Czech hedgehog from Utah to Cherbourg had been cut, melted, and welded. Beach exits were bare. Engineer stockpiles were gone. Bradley needed 2,000 Rhino tanks. Cullen had 1,200. There were 850 still in progress. The final 500 needed steel, and there was none left. A desperate message came in. Engineers had located 300 more hedgehogs scattered across minor beaches. But transport was maxed out, hauling fuel, shells, and rations for Cobra. The steel wouldn't arrive in time. Doherty made the call. We use railroad tracks. It was the only viable alternative. Softer than hedgehog steel, but available in huge quantities. Tracks had already been pulled from abandoned French lines. Some units, like Lieutenant Charles Green's 747th Tank Battalion, had already field-tested them. They called their version the Green Dozer. Cruder, heavier, but it worked. The Ordnance Group shifted gears. From here on, it was a hybrid operation. Cullen's four-prong hedgehog cutters for units with beech steel. Railroad spike battering rams for everyone else. July 23rd, 2 days to Cobra. Production total, 1,800 Rhino tanks complete. Another 500 in final welding. Estimated final, 2,300 Rhinos. 77% of Bradley's armor. Not perfect, but enough. July 24th, forward assembly areas near Marigny. Cullen stood on a ridge, burned hands in his pockets, uniform stiff with grime. He hadn't slept in 72 hours. Black rings under his eyes. Fingernails stained with carbon and flux. But below him, the tanks rolled out. Line after line of Shermans thundered across the fields. Every single one mounted steel prongs on its bow. Rhino teeth, forged from enemy obstacles and twisted rail. They looked like prehistoric predators. Iron beasts built to tear through the oldest walls in Europe. Operation Cobra would begin with a 90-minute airstrike at dawn. 3,000 Allied aircraft. For 1,000 tons of bombs. Then the armor would move. And Cullen's inventions would lead the way. He looked out across the armor and understood the math. For steel prongs, one tank crew, multiply by 3,000. Those prongs weren't scrap metal. They were 14,000 lives. Men who would survive the hedgerows, because someone figured out how to punch through. July 25th, 1944, 6:11 a.m. The earth shook. 1,500 bombers filled the sky over St. Lo. Thunder rolled across Normandy as wave after wave dropped high explosives on German defenses. Forests vanished. Trenches collapsed. Artillery pits became craters. By 7:45 a.m., the air went still. No birds. No wind. No sound but the idle rumble of tank engines. Then the Rhinos moved. Shermans from the 2nd Armored Division surged forward. 3rd Armored followed. 1st Infantry rode in support, rifles raised, ears still ringing from the blast. Every tank at the front had 4 jagged prongs on its bow, Cullen's hedgerow cutter or its heavier cousin made from rail. Radio report, 8:15 a.m. Company B, 2nd Armored. 1st hedgerow objective reached. Lead Sherman accelerated to 25 miles per hour. Impact. The prongs dug deep into the earthen wall, 12 feet thick, for centuries old. In 16 seconds, the Sherman tore through. No damage. No delay. No exposed belly. Just forward motion. More reports came in, rapid fire. Company C breached 3 hedgerows in 20 minutes. Company A smashed through 5 in a row without stopping. Rhino cutters held. No suspension failures. No stalls. Across the assault front, the pattern repeated. The Germans had spent 42 days turning the bocage into a fortress. Curtis Cullen's scrap metal tore through it in minutes. July 25th, 1944, 10:30 a.m. The impossible was happening. Tanks that once took 6 hours to clear a single Norman field were now crossing 5 hedgerows in 5 minutes. Shermans advanced like battering rams. Steel prongs shredded centuries-old earthworks. The Germans were stunned. Their doctrine was built on American predictability. Shermans climbing the hedges, bellies exposed, crews vulnerable to Panzerfaust ambushes and 88 mm fire. But today, the Shermans didn't climb. They punched through. Entire German gun lines lost their aim. Shots fired high. Ambushes missed. Firing solutions invalid. One captured officer later reported. By 10:30 a.m., the 2nd Armored Division had advanced 2 miles. That same distance had taken 3 days the month before. 3rd Armored Division radioed similar progress. The terrain advantage, the impenetrable bocage, was gone. And so was the German grip on Normandy. But the Rhinos weren't invincible. At 11 a.m., the first failure report came through. A Sherman from the 740 first hit a hedgerow with a buried stone foundation. The impact bent the prongs backwards. The tank stopped dead, stuck. The crew bailed out under machine gun fire. 2 didn't make it. 11:20 a.m. A light tank struck a hidden iron fence post buried in the base of a hedgerow. The prongs ripped clean off, tearing part of the bow with them. The tank could still fight, but not break through again. Noon. A tank destroyer using railroad prongs hit a hedge at 30 miles per hour. Too fast. The brackets bent, the prongs twisted sideways, and the right track jammed. The vehicle was immobilized, out of the fight. By 1 p.m. Cullen had a working estimate for percent failure rate. Roughly 92 tanks out of 2,300. That meant 92 crews, nearly 500 men, potentially trapped in fields with German guns zeroing in. Cullen sat in the forward observation post, head set tight, sweat dripping down his back. Most radio traffic was good, tanks breaching at record pace. But the failures gnawed at him. The whole system was a blunt force miracle, not a surgical weapon. It wasn't elegant. It was brutal innovation, and the math was clear. Wide heavy check mark 96% success. Warning 4% failure. Direct hit 60% casualties if they had done nothing. He told himself that. Repeated it. But it didn't make the 4% easier. 1:30 p.m. A transmission came in that changed everything. 3rd Armored has reached the Marigny-St. Gilles Road. For miles inland. For miles. 6 hours. The same distance had taken 2 weeks in June. 3 p.m. Advanced units were 5 miles inland. German infantry units were retreating in disarray, unable to set up new defensive lines fast enough. The bocage, once their shield, was now meaningless. American tanks weren't navigating the terrain. They were crushing it. 4:15 p.m. General Bradley's HQ, field report. Operation Cobra is exceeding all projections. The Rhino device has solved the hedgerow problem. German losses estimated at 3 times U.S. casualties. The stalemate in Normandy was over. The breakout had begun. 5 p.m. Columbia, former production site. Cullen walked alone through the empty field. The welding stations were cold now. Cut steel scraps littered the grass. Burned-out torches lay beside workbenches. The frantic factory they'd built in a cow pasture had served its purpose and vanished with the tanks it forged. He sat on a Jeep hood, sun in his face, eyes heavy. 3 weeks ago, it was a sketch on a ration box. Steel teeth welded from enemy beach defenses. An idea made of junk and desperation. Now, Normandy was moving, because tanks no longer feared the hedgerows. But the engineer in him couldn't ignore the failures. He heard the 4%, saw the names behind it. Stone foundations, fence posts, brackets too thin. I should have tested more angles. Should have braced the mounts better. Should have. But 2,200 Rhino tanks worked. And 14,000 men had advanced through a battlefield designed to kill them. The math was cruel, but undeniable. As the sun dropped behind the trees, Cullen listened to distant artillery echo from 8 miles inland. The bocage was behind them. The future lay ahead. July 26, 1944. Bradley's HQ issued new production orders. Units were encountering more hedgerows deeper in France, scattered, isolated, but still dangerous. The Rhino would remain in service for the rest of the campaign. And Cullen's invention, born from scrap steel and grit, had done something that no plan, no general, and no doctrine had been able to do for 42 days. It broke Normandy open. August 15, 1944, 1,700 hours. Normandy, U.S. 1st Army Headquarters. Sergeant Curtis Cullen stood at attention in front of General Omar Bradley. His hands were still stained with welding dust from that morning's demonstration in Ezenyi. He'd assumed the summons meant trouble. Maybe a review of the 4% failure rate. Maybe a reprimand. 92 tanks lost. Men killed. The ghosts of those reports weighed on him. But Bradley wasn't angry. He was smiling. The general held a manila folder, official letterhead visible, folded crisply. Cullen noticed 2 colonels from Ordnance Command standing behind Bradley, along with a photographer and a young lieutenant from Public Affairs. This wasn't a disciplinary hearing. Bradley nodded. "Sit down, Sergeant." Cullen sat. Bradley opened the folder. "Sergeant Cullen," he began, "on July 13th, you demonstrated a field modification using salvaged enemy beach defenses that enabled U.S. armored forces to breach terrain previously considered impassable. Over the course of 12 days, that modification allowed our tanks to advance over 40 miles, cut off multiple German divisions, and reduce American tank casualties by 37%. He paused. Captured enemy reports refer to your device as Eisenhower's on iron tusks. A small chuckle passed around the room. Bradley turned a page. This commendation is signed by myself and General Eisenhower. It authorizes immediate promotion to staff sergeant and includes a Bronze Star for meritorious service in direct support of combat operations. He closed the folder and slid it across the desk. Cullen didn't move. He blinked. All he could think of was the ration box. The sketch. The first time he struck steel the tank. The first failure. The sound of dirt giving way. The smell of burnt insulation in the Columbia field at midnight. All those welders, sleeping in shifts. All those tanks, rumbling into the bocage like prehistoric beasts. The 4%. And the 96. Bradley leaned forward. You didn't save tanks, Cullen. You saved time. And in war, time saves lives. August 18, 1944. The Rhino device was officially adopted into U.S. Army field manuals under the designation Hedge Breaching Modification Kit, Type A. By then, over 3,000 Shermans had been equipped or retrofitted with Cullen's cutters. Some units retired them as the terrain changed. Others kept them through Belgium, Luxembourg, the Ardennes. A few Shermans entered Germany in early 1945 with battered, rust-streaked tusks still bolted to their hulls, relics of the battlefields behind them. Photographs from the liberation of Paris show Rhino tanks on the Champs-Élysées, steel prongs jutting out like bayonets. Civilians had no idea what they were looking at, but American tankers knew. Those weren't scrap metal. They were survival. After the war, Cullen returned to the U.S. quietly. He never claimed to be an inventor. He called himself a maintenance guy with a torch and a deadline. He lived in Pennsylvania, worked for the Army Corps of Engineers, raised 2 sons. Both became mechanics. He died in 1980. No parades, no ceremonies. But at Fort Moore, formerly Fort Benning, an M4 Sherman Rhino sits on display with the original Hedgehog steel mounted to its bow. A bronze plaque reads, "This modification, conceived and tested in the field by SSG Curtis Cullen, broke the stalemate in Normandy and allowed U.S. armored forces to liberate France." Every tank crew that drove through the bocage without exposing their bellies owes their lives to a welder who saw trash and thought, this might work. August 15, 1944. Bradley opened the folder and slid a document across the desk. Cullen looked down and froze. It was a formal recommendation for the Legion of Merit, signed by General Omar Bradley and co-signed by Major General Leonard Jarrow. Bradley spoke plainly. You're being awarded the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct. Your hedgerow cutting device directly contributed to the success of Operation Cobra and saved an estimated 1,500 American lives. Cullen blinked. The Legion of Merit was the 4th highest military decoration in the U.S. Army, typically reserved for senior officers, campaign-level command, or extraordinary leadership in theater. He was a welder, a cavalry sergeant with burns on his hands and steel shavings in his boots. "Sir," he said quietly, "I just welded some steel to tanks." Bradley shook his head. "No. You solved a problem that stopped First Army for 6 weeks. You broke the deadlock. And every tank commander from here to Paris knows your name." He tapped the folder. Effective immediately, the Army is officially designating your invention the Cullen Hedgerow Cutter. It's in the records. You earned this. August 20th, 1944, near St. Lo. A small ceremony was held in a field surrounded by torn hedgerows and scorched trees. Bradley personally pinned the Legion of Merit to Cullen's uniform. Roughly 200 men stood in the crowd. Officers, tankers, engineers, welders who had worked around the clock under floodlights to build his devices. Lieutenant Charles Green from the 747th Tank Battalion was there. His unit had breached 47 hedgerows during Cobra. 0 casualties. The official citation credited Staff Sergeant Cullen with exceptional ingenuity and technical skill in developing a combat modification that overcame formidable terrain obstacles and directly enabled the Allied advance through Normandy. His innovation led to the production of 2,850 devices and reduced expected casualties by thousands. The moment was quiet, informal, real. No parade, no brass band. just tank crews nodding silently to the man who gave them a fighting chance. The ripple spread fast. Within days, news of Cullen's device reached Allied commands across Europe. British tank units requested technical specifications. The 21st Army Group produced 300 similar devices using scrap from their beach sectors. They called them prongs instead of rhinos. Canadian armored units manufactured another 200 using salvaged German steel. They painted them white with red maple leaves. The Soviets received technical drawings via Lend-Lease. They never adopted the design. Soviet doctrine didn't bend to terrain, it crushed it. Artillery turned hedgerows into mulch. By September 1944, the Cullen device was featured in U.S. Army training manuals. The Armored Force School at Fort Knox added hedgerow breach techniques to its official doctrine. New tank crews were trained. Approach at 25 miles per hour. Strike the hedge at its base. Maintain forward momentum for 15 seconds. Clear the opposite side. Do not expose your belly. Field innovation continued into the fall. Some tank crews welded serrated teeth onto the prongs to improve root penetration. Others added angled deflector plates to prevent snagging on buried stones. A few created folding variants that could retract after breaching. As the Allies moved beyond the bocage, the terrain opened. The devices saw limited use after Normandy. Crews began removing the 320-pound prongs to improve fuel efficiency and road speed. But the lesson stayed with them. When American forces encountered Dragon's teeth tank traps in Germany, engineers improvised ramps from rubble and scrap iron, a direct echo of Cullen's breakthrough. The precedent had been set. In war, field improvisation saves lives. August 25, 1944. Cullen returned to his old unit, the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. No parade, no speech, no special assignment. Just another soldier with a wrench and a radio, pushing east through France toward the German border. He resumed his duties as a cavalry sergeant, because that's who he was, and that's who he'd always been. Not a hero, just a welder, who changed the war with trash steel and a deadline. The war didn't end with Normandy. Curtis Cullen stayed in combat. He fought through the fall of 1944, September, October, as his unit crossed France field by field. In November, they entered Germany. In April, they reached the Elbe River. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. The war was over. Cullen had served nearly 3 years in combat. He was 30 years old. The Rhino tanks were mostly gone by then. The hedgerow problem, so dominant just months earlier, was now 600 miles behind the front line. The world had moved on to new battles, new terrain, new enemies. June 1945, Curtis Cullen returned to the United States. He received his discharge papers. The Legion of Merit was listed in his official record. So was the Cullen hedgerow cutter. But civilian life didn't care about wartime innovations. He needed a job. He returned to Cranford, New Jersey. In September 1945, he married Bernice Enright. They moved to New York City. Cullen found work with Shenley Industries, a spirits company. No tanks, no tools, just a steady paycheck and a second chance at normal life. The hedgerow story followed him, but only locally. The Cranford Citizen and Chronicle ran a feature while he was still overseas, calling him the sergeant who solved Normandy. They described the matches, the beach steel, the moment Bradley watched his tank punch through a 500-year-old wall. But national attention never came. The war moved on. The headlines shifted to Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and victory in Japan. A tank mod from July 1944 was just a footnote. Until 1951. That year, General Omar Bradley published his memoir, A Soldier's Story. Bradley described the Normandy campaign in vivid detail, the terrain, the stalemate, the hedgerows that baffled an army. And he named Cullen. An absurdly simple solution, Bradley wrote. So simple it embarrassed us. A welded invention made from German beach scrap solved a problem we hadn't cracked in 5 weeks. The book reached historians, tacticians, officers in training. The spotlight turned back on Cullen, at least for a moment. In 1953, the U.S. Army published its official history of the European theater. It included several paragraphs on the Cullen device and credited it with accelerating Operation Cobra by up to 6 weeks, saving thousands of lives, and helping in the Normandy deadlock. Cullen didn't do interviews. He didn't go on speaking tours. He stayed in New York, worked at Shinley Industries through the 1950s, lived quietly with Bernice. He joined the Sons of the American Revolution, tracing his ancestry to Colonel Curtis Grubb, a Revolutionary War officer. That was his legacy now, a patriot from a long line of patriots, and a man who, for a few weeks in 1944, changed the course of the war with scrap metal and timing. But the impact of his idea lived on. The Cullen device became a case study in military innovation. The Army revised its field manuals, emphasizing frontline improvisation and empowering non-officers to solve problems with what they had. NATO forces adopted similar doctrines. Even the Soviets, who dismissed the cutter itself, began allowing more tactical flexibility at lower command levels. The hedgerow cutter became doctrine by example. The actual Rhino tanks? Mostly gone. One was preserved at the Patton Museum in Fort Knox. Another found its way to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. A few more rusted in barns across Normandy, forgotten by history. But the design principles survived. Modern combat engineers still study Cullen's solution in training courses, not because of what it looked like, but because of what it represented. Solve the problem in front of you. Use what you have. Get your people home. The same principle guided U.S. troops decades later in Iraq and Afghanistan. Soldiers building counter-IED equipment from scrap wire, wood, and steel. Same mindset. Same lineage. Different war. Curtis G. Cullen died on November 20th, 1963. He passed away in Greenwich Village, New York. He was 48 years old. No headlines. No memorials. No movies. But ask any tank commander what a Rhino tank is. They'll tell you. It's the thing that saved their grandfather's life in Normandy. It's the reason their unit got past St. Lo. It's a reminder that one man with an idea and a blowtorch can change the course of a war. Curtis Cullen died on November 20th, 1963. His obituary ran in a few local papers. It mentioned his Legion of Merit. It mentioned the hedgerow cutter. But the notice was short. No headlines. No interviews. No national reflection. Outside of military circles, few people remembered the innovation or the man behind it. 1 year later, something unexpected happened. June 6, 1964, the 20th anniversary of D-Day. President Dwight D. Eisenhower appeared on national television in an interview with CBS correspondent Walter Cronkite. They stood together in Normandy, in a field near St. Lo, the same ground where the first hedgerow demonstration had taken place. The hedgerows were still there, still 12 feet high, still solid as stone. Cronkite asked about the bocage problem, and Eisenhower didn't hesitate. He told the story of the hedgerow cutter. He named Curtis Cullen. He explained how one sergeant from New Jersey had solved a problem that had stalled an entire army. "We were losing tanks by the hundreds," Eisenhower said. One enlisted man welded a few scraps of German beech steel to a Sherman. That single act changed the entire campaign. The interview aired that night to millions of Americans. And in 10 minutes of black and white footage, Cullen's beech scrap solution became legend. He wasn't alive to see it. But now, everyone knew what he had done. The recognition had actually started before Operation Cobra was finished. On July 28, 1944, 1st Army Headquarters issued Technical Bulletin TBR 231. It officially designated the field invention as Hedgerow Cutting Device M1 Cullen type. The bulletin included installation specs, tactical employment guidelines, maintenance procedures. What began as a field modification was now standard Army equipment. Supply depots stocked prongs. Training manuals included breach techniques. Maintenance crews carried welding diagrams. A sketch on a ration box became Army doctrine in 3 weeks. It didn't stop with 1st Army. 3rd Army adopted the cutter on August 1st, just as General Patton began his charge across France. His after-action reports credited the devices with rapid advances through Brittany's bocage terrain. 9th Army manufactured 200 additional devices using salvaged steel from German bunkers. The British 21st Army Group formally requested American technical support on August 5th. British engineers visited the production site at Colombiers. They created their own variant. Prong device, Mark I. Canadian forces built their version 2. Obstacle cutter, improvised Type A. On August 15th, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAF, issued a commendation. An example of enlisted initiative solving an operational-level problem. Tactical solutions may originate from any rank. That citation was sent to every Allied army in Europe, and every soldier who saw it understood what it meant. Innovation is rank-blind. Courage is not limited to command. The stats came later, and they were staggering. Sherman losses per engagement dropped from 8.3% to 4.7%. Crew casualties decreased by 37%. Time to breach bocage terrain dropped by 73%. The economic impact? A destroyed Sherman cost $63,000 in 1944. A Cullen hedgerow cutter cost $40 in scrap steel and 12 hours of welding. The devices saved an estimated 300 tanks during Operation Cobra. That's $18.9 million in preserved equipment, not counting the lives of the crews. Their report changed everything. In November 1944, the U.S. Army implemented a new requirement. Every tank crew trained after that date would learn Cullen's breach technique. It became part of basic qualification, not just theory, but field practice. Field Manual FM 17-33. The Armored Battalion received a doctrinal update in December 1944. It included an entire chapter on hedgerow breaching using improvised cutting devices. Diagrams showed proper prong installation. Tactical sections outlined how to approach, breach, and clear a hedge. Maintenance sections covered field repairs with basic tools. But the impact wasn't limited to tankers. Combat engineer schools incorporated the concept of turning enemy obstacles into useful materials. Infantry officers were taught to identify breach points to support armor. Artillery forward observers learned to coordinate fires in support of breaching operations. By early 1945, hedgerow breaching was not a tactic, it was doctrine. That doctrine outlived the war. In the early years of the Cold War, NATO forces tasked with defending Central Europe studied the bocage campaign closely. They recognized that terrain could stall an army, unless initiative, improvisation, and field engineering filled the gaps. Even Warsaw Pact analysts noted it. Soviet military publications in the 1950s cited the Cullen device as an example of capitalist tactical flexibility that bypasses central planning. The U.S. Army Combat Studies Institute began using the hedgerow cutter as a core teaching case in 1953. At West Point, officer candidates studied the decision-making process that led to its adoption. In enlisted leadership courses, the moral was clear. Tactical problems can be solved at any rank, with courage, with initiative, with a cutting torch if necessary. By 1960, the Cullen cutter was taught in 16 military training programs across NATO. More than 50,000 soldiers studied the innovation. The idea that a sergeant's sketch on a ration box could shift the outcome of a campaign became institutional military knowledge. But Curtis Cullen never taught those classes. He never stood at a podium, never gave a lecture. He didn't visit Fort Knox. He never saw the doctrine manuals that bore his name. He worked at Shinley Industries, lived in New York City, and died in 1963, 18 months before Eisenhower's TV interview made him a household name. The question became clear. Would Cullen's contribution survive beyond military textbooks, or fade into the kind of obscurity that claims most battlefield innovations? The modern legacy of Curtis Cullen exists in three places: museum exhibits, military doctrine, the memories of veterans who lived because of 4 steel prongs welded to tank bows. The Patton Museum at Fort Knox displays an original M4 Sherman with Cullen's cutter still mounted. A bronze placard explains the bocage problem. It tells the story of a sergeant from Cranford, New Jersey, who turned German beech steel into a weapon of liberation. More than 30,000 visitors pass the exhibit every year. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans acquired a Rhino Sherman in 2007. The exhibit includes rare photos of the production line at Colombiers, a copy of Bradley's original orders, and an interactive display that teaches kids how steel, geometry, and momentum broke through walls 500 years old. The Musée du Débarquement in Normandy has a small display of field innovations. In the corner, 3 rusted prongs recovered from a disabled Sherman near St. Lo. Most French visitors walk past without knowing what they are. American veterans don't. They stop. They explain it to their grandchildren. And they remember the man who welded scrap into survival. But the most important legacy isn't in museums. It's in doctrine. Every modern military force, from NATO to the U.S. Army to the Marines, teaches the principle Curtis Cullen demonstrated in 1944. Strategic problems can be solved with available materials, tactical initiative, and 15 seconds of courage. That principle shaped equipment development, training doctrine, command philosophy. For the next 80 years, the hedgerow cutter's DNA appears wherever soldiers face unexpected threats. In Iraq, when Humvee crews welded scrap metal into makeshift armor. In Afghanistan, when engineers modified mine-resistant vehicles with field-fabricated upgrades. In every forward operating base where troops don't wait for official gear, they build their own solutions. Curtis Cullen's grave is in New Jersey. The headstone mentions his military service and his Legion of Merit. It doesn't mention the hedgerow cutter. It doesn't need to. Most people walk past that stone without knowing who he was. They don't know that 1,500 men came home from Normandy because of something he built from beach trash and steel torch cuts. But those 1,500 men, they had children, and their children had children. And now there are thousands, maybe tens of thousands, alive today because of 4 steel prongs welded to tank bows. Cullen never knew that. He never saw the ripple effect. He died thinking his invention was a footnote. He never gave interviews, never wrote a memoir, never stepped on a stage. Just a sergeant from Cranford, who looked at enemy obstacles and imagined what they could become if you flipped them upside down and welded them to an American tank. The last surviving member of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron died in 2019. His obituary mentioned serving alongside Cullen, and in one sentence, he summed up everything. I remember watching the first breach. That's when I knew we were going to survive Normandy. That's the real legacy. Not the medals, not the museum plaques, not the doctrine manuals. The legacy is measured in lives. 1,500 tankers who didn't burn to death in Norman fields. 1,500 families who got their sons and husbands and fathers back. A generation that grew up because one man didn't wait for orders. He built a solution with scrap and guts and a blowtorch. And it all started with a sketch on a ration box. On a beach. In July 1944.